Story 1. Surviving a drowning after being gone for 12 to 15 minutes. I was resuscitated and spent 2 days on life support. I lost a third of my body weight but walked out of the hospital less than a week later. I received a full clean bill of health 2 weeks after that and had no permanent damage. Story 2. The car was broken into and everything was stolen, including a handbag in the trunk that contained a wedding ring and an engagement ring. The bag was found in a field weeks later and handed to the police. We were called to verify if it was ours. There was a hole in the pocket where the rings were, and they had fallen into it and were still there. Story 3. Back in 2004, I had been hitchhiking around the western United States for a couple of months. Summer was coming to an end, and I was planning to make my way back to Indiana, where my parents lived. I was on the Oregon coast when I was picked up by a biology teacher, whom we will call Scott, from New York. Scott was on his summer break hiking in different parks out west, but was also about to start his trek back home. Since Indiana was on the way, I asked if I could tag along and possibly get dropped off in Indiana. He mentioned he had a few more hikes and peaks planned, but if I was okay with that, I was welcome to join him. We visited Mount Hood and South Sister in Oregon, Canyonlands in Utah, and a couple of peaks in Colorado. He then took me all the way back to Indiana and dropped me off at my parents' house. It was a wonderful time, and we exchanged emails to keep in touch. As time passed, the emails became infrequent, but every now and then, one of us would reach out to check in. In 2015, I moved to Boise, Idaho. Sometime in 2016 or 2017, I checked that old email address of mine and found an email from Scott asking how I was doing. I replied, informing him that I was in Idaho now and provided my phone number, as that was a much easier way to get in touch. About 30 minutes after I sent that email, I received a text from Scott. He said that was amazing and invited me to Payette Brewery for a beer. He lived in Boise, too, but it gets even more surprising. I couldn't join him right then, but we agreed to meet later that evening. Scott invited me to his house and sent me his address. When I typed it into the map application, I was in shock. He lived only 3 blocks away from me. We were neighbors. Story 4. I started playing World of Warcraft when it launched while living in California. A year and a half later, I moved across the country to a very small town in Tennessee, where the population doubles when college is in session. While waiting for a guild meeting, my guildmates began sharing where they were from. One guy I was friends with said he lived in the same small town. Then he mentioned he was in the same part of town, the same apartment complex, and ultimately the same building. He was 2 doors down from me, part of a row of townhouses. I said, "Hold on, step outside." Moments later, we were face to face. Countless hours spent playing together, not realizing we were only separated by a single neighbor's room. We became great friends and hung out in and out of the game for several years until I moved back to California. Story 5. My son and I watched the eclipse in Wyoming on August 21st, 2017. He asked when the next one would be. Aside from the recent eclipse in April 2024, we discovered there will be another in our hometown on August 12, 2045. He noticed that he would be about the same age on that date as I was during the Wyoming eclipse. I was 41, and he will be 41 at the future event. We did the math. As it turns out, on August 21st, 2017, I was 15,206 days old. On August 12, 2045, my son will also be 15,206 days old. I hope to enjoy it with him. Story 6. Not me, but my old neighbor. Let's call him Jimmy. He and his wife decided to go on a once-in-a-lifetime trip to Australia and New Zealand. At one point, he was driving through a really remote part of New Zealand when his rental car broke down. This was before mobile phones. There were no other cars on the road, just endless countryside around him. He set off for the one building he could see, some farm further down the road and about a mile up its own driveway. He finally reached it, knocked on the door, and a woman answered. She took one look at him and said, "What the hell are you doing here, Jimmy?" She had attended the same school as him, in the same tiny village in the UK. She had emigrated over 30 years before and ended up on this remote farm. Story 7. Stuck in traffic on the George Washington Bridge, I looked in my rearview mirror and realized my parents were in the car right behind me. They lived in a different state. It was completely random chance. Could be worse. My friend has been struck by lightning twice and, independently of that, once woke up naked in a morgue with a toe tag on. This is not a prank. He had been surfing with his partner, got hit by a wave, and the bungee attaching him to his board got snagged on a rock underwater. He remembers seeing the surface but being unable to reach it. His partner fished him out, called emergency services, and performed CPR for about 45 minutes until paramedics arrived. They said, "Nope, he's gone." She replied, "Are you sure? Because I thought." They responded, "Nope." So they bagged and tagged him. Then he woke up in the morgue. Cold water. There was no permanent damage, but you can bet that the lawsuit paid for his chef training. Story 8. I was in the World Trade Center both times it was attacked in 1993 and 2001, so guess what tourist attraction I will not visit? I am not giving them another chance. Story 9. My favorite Chinese restaurant is in Ohio. I went to Hawaii and tasted the pepper steak at a restaurant, mentioning to the owner that it tasted the same as the one in Ohio. The owner was the brother of the Ohio restaurant's owner. Story 10. I dropped a quarter while searching for something in my pocket and didn't notice where it rolled. I was on a blacktop driveway, so I thought finding it would be easy. However, when I began to look for it, I couldn't find it anywhere. Finally, I decided to drop another quarter in the same direction I believed the first one had rolled. I watched the second quarter roll up to the house and underneath the screen door. I realized that was likely where the first quarter was as well. I went over to the screen door and opened it, but there was only one quarter. I wondered where the first quarter had gone. I bent down to pick up my second quarter and discovered two quarters. The second quarter had landed directly on top of the first one under the screen door, dropped from about 15 feet away. Story 11. When I was on holiday as a child in Ireland, our car broke down while going up a hill. A farmer came out and towed us back to the cottage where we were staying. The following year, while driving up the same hill, the car broke down again in the same spot. The same farmer came out of his house and said, "Didn't I see you here last year?" Story 12. My stolen bike was recovered by the police. The thief was arrested and jailed. It was a miracle of a series of fortunate events. Since this comment has gained some traction, I decided to share the story. In 2009, I bought a distinctive bike, a 2008 Bianchi San Jose, and decided to ride it to work. I worked in downtown Brooklyn in an area called Metrotech, which features a series of 20-story buildings and a public common area run by JP Chase. I locked my bike at a rack between the buildings at 9 a.m. When I went to leave at 5 p.m., the bike was gone. After collecting myself from the shock of my new bike being stolen, I went over to the security office at Metrotech. The person at the front desk heard my story but pretty much gave up, saying there was no hope. However, while we were talking, a man in a suit walked in and introduced himself as running security for the entire complex. He asked me a few questions and said he would review some of the security footage, but he couldn't promise anything. I thanked him and went home, making some posts on NYC bicycle forums that night with pictures. I was thoroughly depressed. The next day, I took a little break from work and walked over to the police precinct to file a report around 10 a.m. Of course, this being New York City, the lady taking the statement treated me like I was wasting her time, as this kind of thing happens all the time. However, around 3 p.m., I was sitting at my desk at work when I received a call from a man with a thick Brooklyn accent. "Is this you?" "Yes." "Do you own a Bianchi bicycle?" "Yes." "Does it have a sticker on it?" "What does it say?" "Yes, Robert's Bicycles, Bayside, Queens. We have your bike. Meet me at the precinct." When I arrived at the precinct, I identified my bike. They informed me that the man who stole it was being booked, and they shared the story. New York City has undercover police officers who patrol in unmarked cars. These officers happened to be driving around the Park Slope area, which is relatively affluent, when they saw a man with a brand new bike that had a piece of notebook paper taped to the front saying $200. They stopped and questioned him, asking, "Is that your bike? Where did you get it?" The man was obviously lying, but they had no proof to act on. They got back in their car and drove off. As they were driving, they received a radio call to head to Metro Tech Security. When they arrived, the head of security said he had footage of a man stealing a bicycle. The image of the man and the bike was clear. The bike had distinctive stripes, making it unmistakable. The officers reviewed the footage and realized it was the same man they had just questioned. They retrieved the footage and rushed back to the spot where they had seen him, and to their surprise, he was still there. They arrested him and confiscated the bike. Since they had the video, the police report, and had personally witnessed him trying to sell it, I got my bike back immediately and never had to go to court. What are the odds that the head of security walked into that office, found the footage, and that the same officers who encountered the thief were called to review it? Why did the thief stay at the same corner? Why didn't he remove the sticker? It was miraculous. After all this, I received messages on the bicycle forums from people in Park Slope who saw the man trying to sell the bike. Apparently, he was getting a lot of backlash from passersby because he was obviously trying to sell stolen goods. Story 13. I have a hemorrhagic cavernoma in the right paracentral hemisphere of my brain, which is a malformed blood vessel. It opened up, bleeding into my brain, and that caused a hemorrhagic stroke. The survival rate is about 3%, and if you do survive, you usually have major neurological or motor function problems. I don't really suffer from much. I was having some minor seizures, but I'm on medication for that now, so I'm really okay. They conducted a study on me to see why I came out in such good condition. Perhaps the reasons for my recovery could lead to some form of treatment, but they found nothing conclusive. Story 14. I recently had a phone call with my grandma. She told me that she and her husband went on a trip the other day. They sat down at a table they thought was free, but a few moments later, another couple of the same age came by and said they had already occupied the table. However, they could sit together and enjoy coffee. So they did, and my grandmother and the other woman started to talk. At one point, the other woman mentioned her surname, which was not only uncommon but also seemed familiar to my grandma. It turned out that the other woman and my grandma were neighbors in a small German village years ago but had to leave during World War II. Over 80 years later, they met again because my grandma sat down at an occupied table hundreds of kilometers away from their village. Story 15. I took my kids on a family vacation to the beach, and my car was acting up the entire time. I had a 2010 Chevy Traverse, and it kept not wanting to start, but I jumped it and started heading home after a week of taking care of it. I was in Ocean Shores, headed back to Central Washington, about 6 hours away. As I drove through Olympia, the car broke down completely. I pulled off to the side of the road, and a big truck pulling a camper stopped behind me. The driver said he could jumpstart my car, and he did. The car started and was running well. About 15 minutes later, I heard a loud thunk, and the car died this time permanently. I pulled over again. After about 20 minutes, the same truck pulled over. At that point, I was 5 hours away from home. The guy said, "It looks like it's done for, but if you tell me where you live, I can take you most of the way." I told him my city, and he laughed, saying, "Me too." When I asked what street he lived on, I discovered he lived just 4 houses down. I packed what I could into his camper, and he took me, my wife, and our 3 kids home. I made sure to thank him, and every Thanksgiving and Christmas, I brought him either a turkey or a ham as a token of my appreciation. Several years later, after my divorce, I met my current girlfriend. My Tahoe needed new wheel bearings, and I was so busy with work that I had no time to do it myself. I was working over 80 hours a week at times, so I wanted to pay someone to do it. She mentioned that her dad had a friend who would do it fairly reasonably if I bought the parts. I agreed, and she took me to his shop. It was the same guy who had helped me years ago. I got out of the car and gave him a big hug, telling him I would pay whatever he wanted, and left my Tahoe there. I also gave him a gift card to a nice local restaurant as a thank you. About 6 months later, I was trying to rescue a stray kitten from under a car in a blazing hot parking lot, with temperatures over 110 degrees on the asphalt. I chased the kitten right under a truck, and the driver, waiting for his wife, stepped out. There he was again. Every time I have needed help in the past few years, it seems like he's always there. It feels almost miraculous. It's not like I live in a small town. There are over 400,000 people in my city. I had gone 30 years without running into people who frequent the same places I do. Story 16. I had a baby with a life-threatening birth defect. Only 1,600 babies a year are born with congenital diaphragmatic hernia, and my little girl is one of them. We are incredibly fortunate that she survived and is thriving. Story 17. In eastern North Carolina, I overheard a table speaking German while I was waiting tables in college. I was learning to speak German at the time and decided to greet them. It turns out they were living in the United States, and after 10 years we have taken several trips to Europe together, and they are among my closest friends. If I hadn't said a simple hello in a language I was learning, I would not have had most of my international experiences and connections. Story 18. I had my partner's aunt on their dad's side show us Tillamook ice cream for the first time ever. I had never heard of it or tried it, but it was good. We had caramel toffee crunch flavor. The next day, someone at work randomly brought everyone ice cream, and it was Tillamook caramel toffee crunch flavor. They had never brought us ice cream before. This was entirely random and out of nowhere. Literally the day after that, we saw my partner's mom. Their parents are divorced and don't talk, but she had something she just had to show us. It was Tillamook, specifically caramel toffee crunch flavor. Finally, the next day we visited my parents. They didn't have it, but my mom asked us if we had ever tried Tillamook because it's really creamy and she likes the caramel toffee flavor. I felt like I was in a Groundhog Day-themed ice cream advertisement. Story 19. On Reddit, someone found a camera memory card in Australia and posted some photos from it to help find the owner. The photos were of my coworker in Los Angeles. Story 20. A pigeon defecated in my mouth. I was doing a Ray Charles impression at the time, and suddenly it happened. I'd like to think that was Ray Charles's way of telling me to leave myself alone. Story 21. I lived. Doctors told my parents they would be surprised if I made it to 2, then 5, then 10, and 18. After 18, I was out of the woods and had a whole life left to live. Story 22. I did poorly in high school but ended up getting into Harvard for graduate school, and have been a researcher at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology for over a decade now. Story 23. I am 6 feet 5 inches tall and work in a regular office. In my row of 8 cubicles, there are 2 guys taller than me. On my side of the office, which has about 50 cubicles, there are 3 guys taller than I am. I looked up the odds of that happening, and it's roughly 1 in 500 million. I have a better chance of winning the lottery, except my prize is being teased for being short. Story 24. Years ago, I matched with someone on a dating site, and we both discovered that we live in exactly the same suburb. That isn't the improbable statistic. What really surprised us was when we talked about our pets. We discovered that we both have a cat named Ramon, which we originally named Ramona before realizing weeks later that he was not, in fact, female. What a wild coincidence. Story 25. I connected with the foreign exchange student when I was 14 or 15. A few years later, she added me on Facebook. We talked a bit, and she mentioned needing to come to England to work on her bachelor's degree. I offered to have her stay with us again. Now we have been together for 10 years, married for 4, and we have 2 children. Story 26. The day my car was towed for parking on a snowplow street on November 1st, the first day of the rule change, it cost me half a day and $400. That night, I went to bingo and won the jackpot worth $400. Later that year, I attended a black tie charity event for the Brookfield Zoo. 5 raffle tickets were sold for $100. You put a ticket in the bucket in front of your desired item. I won 2 of the 5 items. A Chanel bag worth $2,000 in 1994 and a David Yurman black diamond ring and bracelet worth $3,000. I don't know why I even bother buying lottery tickets. My lifelong probability has been exhausted in that 1 year. Story 27. Not directly to me, but rather my family. My father was the only person in the United States to have both a double bypass and a double lung transplant at the same time due to pulmonary fibrosis. He likely developed this condition from being a firefighter at the Twin Towers. He survived the procedure but fought for his life for 9 more months in the intensive care unit. He never left the hospital and passed away 2 weeks ago. Story 28. I had a foster son who did not know much about his grandparents or extended family. He and my son were best friends. When the boys turned 18, I decided to move across the county to be closer to my sister. My son and his friend came with us. My sister threw a welcome party. One of her friends, an older lady, looked at my foster son and said she knew him. This seemed impossible since he was from the other side of the country. The friend and the boy talked for a while, and within half an hour, it was realized that the friend knew his grandparents when they were all in a motorcycle club in another state in the 1970s. She knew his dad from the time he was born through his first 5 years. All the names checked out and his dad confirmed it. It was absolutely unbelievable. The friend filled a lot of gaps for the boy and his dad. It was a really interesting night. Story 29. My daughter absorbed her twin, has extra bones, and is rather asymmetric because of it. 12 surgeries later, she is living a pretty normal life. It would not surprise me at all if she is a chimera and tests genetically different in different parts of her body. Story 30. Less about me and more about my classmate who lived in the neighborhood across from mine. I was outside when his house blew up from a gas explosion. Luckily, they weren't at home. I was also outside when, 2 days later, a fighter jet crashed into the woods behind their house. The pilot was fine. Story 31. My dad has a genetic heart defect that he discovered at age 60. It is passed down through males and is known as a bicuspid aortic valve. The chance of passing it to first-degree relatives is around 9%. My dad's discovery came when this defect caused serious health issues for him twice in 1 year. Given this emotional trauma, it was time for my brother to get checked. He has it as well. What are the chances that he passed it on to both of us? I am a male, and hopefully, I will also make it to 60 before it affects me. Story 32. I was walking down the sidewalk when some scaffolding gave way and almost crashed down on me. Fortunately, someone pushed me out of the way. 10 years later, a bus lost its brakes and nearly hit me, but someone pulled me to safety. The strange part? It was the same person who saved me both times. Story 33. I almost drove a golf cart off the side of the mountain when I was 8. I hit a tree, which stopped me right before the cliff. I am very lucky to be alive. Story 34. I got hit in the face with a frozen lime. Then my neighbor was struck by a frozen orange. More frozen fruit fell from the sky and damaged houses and cars. Finally, I realized it was a group of teenagers using a potato cannon, and I was hit in the face again with another frozen lime. Story 35. My dad, son, and I share the same birth month and day. My husband lost his ring in the ocean. A week later, when we arrived home from Florida, I opened the first Facebook page I found for that area and asked if anyone had found it. Not even 10 minutes later, someone replied and stated that they thought they had his ring but asked for a more detailed description. Sure enough, it was his, and the lady mailed the ring to me from Massachusetts. The ring washed up on the Florida beach 2 days after we lost it and was discovered without the use of a metal detector. Story 36. I developed a very rare tumor typically found in males, which usually occurs in women at an older age, around 50 years, when I was only 16. Story 37. I was working at a roadhouse in Western Australia when a guy walked in wearing a high school t-shirt almost 10 years after I graduated. It turns out he was in the year below me, and we knew many of the same people. We are American. I probably saw him every week for 3 years and never knew him until he chose to wear that old high school t-shirt on that specific day. Story 38. A rare complication of surgery affected my vagus nerve, causing my heart to stop randomly. 3 months later, after numerous tests at the age of 32, I received a dual-lead pacemaker. My cardiologist, who is the best in my state and a highly regarded professor, has never encountered this issue before and has now started researching it. Story 39. I was run over by a car but was not injured. Over 30 years later, I was hit by another car but remained uninjured. Both incidents occurred while riding a bicycle. My dad always said I have two guardian angels. Story 40. Jumped off a boat while docked in Cabo. The water was probably 20 feet deep. I didn't realize for hours that my Apple Watch had come off. Panicked and immediately started to cope with the fact that it was gone. The captain said, "I'll go get it." He hopped in the water with goggles and flippers. 15 minutes later, he surfaced with it. He explained that he followed the anchor line down and the current to determine where I must have entered the water when I jumped in. He briefly scanned the area and located it. The watch was already in water mode and was completely unharmed. Absolutely incredible. I tipped well for that charter. Story 41. My husband lost his medical license twice and had affairs with his patients. Our house burned to the ground, and my husband was investigated before he absconded to his home country, Argentina. I found out the house was in foreclosure, and our Jeep Rubicon was stolen. The Federal Bureau of Investigation contacted me to inform me that our papers were found in a chop shop, but it was too late for the Jeep. I contacted our insurance company, who was delaying our payment. Then my son overdosed and died. I also discovered that my aunt had stolen from and was abusing my mother. My mother fell, cracked her head, and died from a brain bleed. The improbable part of all this is that it all happened in 1 year. Now I just stay in my safe home bubble. Story 42. My ex-wife found me a new girlfriend before we split up. She also found one for herself. Story 43. I was abandoned in a strawberry field wearing nothing but a pair of tassels. Needless to say, I never spoke to the man again. Story 44. I have been diagnosed with a rare medical condition called post-selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor sexual dysfunction after using a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor antidepressant. It is a persistent sexual dysfunction that continues indefinitely after stopping the medication. Doctors deny its existence, making it statistically improbable that I and thousands of people worldwide have experienced this devastating side effect. Story 45. I was born at 3 pounds, 5 ounces full term, with the umbilical cord wrapped around my neck multiple times. Bonus. My father had been a Catholic priest for over 20 years before quitting to marry my mother. He dropped her off at the hospital and rode an elevator to the maternity floor after parking the car. Someone else in the elevator asked him if he was going to be a father for the first time. I hope I see the next time this gets asked because it's a doozy. My husband and I used the same 3 words for the word game on our anniversary. Both of us in different locations across town from each other, while I was in the emergency room with our middle child. I should add that I used the same username on social media, and his account is linked to mine with his real name, so it's not doxing, and no one will see this. Story 46. Both of my parents are severely obese and have struggled with addiction to alcohol since they were 15. At 43, I drink lightly, do not use drugs, and have never been obese. Story 47. During a severe ice storm in February 2021, we were without power and sitting in front of our fireplace to stay warm and wait out the storm. As we chatted about life to pass the time, my wife mentioned one of the large white oak trees near our house and how this storm reminded her that it was a tree we needed to take down, as it had always concerned her. Less than 5 minutes later, that very tree crashed down on our house. It was one of the scariest moments we ever experienced. We were okay, but numerous repairs were needed, and we had to stay with her parents for about 6 weeks before the house was livable again. The tree was not dead, was not leaning, and had a strong root system. The weight of the ice, the wind, and the moisture in the ground created the perfect conditions for it to fall. Story 48. I am just a regular guy. I pulled a man out of a burning bus after witnessing it jump a T-intersection at a railroad track. I rescued a man from his truck after it rolled over. He was unconscious because the truck rolled while going around a turn and a tire blew. I protected a woman's head when she started falling over at an outdoor art show in the middle of summer. She then began having a seizure and biting her lip. I used my pen to help her. She stopped breathing, so I performed CPR for what felt like an eternity, but it was about 3 minutes. I have no medical training other than my annual Red Cross first aid and CPR courses. The odds are pretty high, I suppose. Story 49. I used to deliver in the city center on a bicycle. Despite being the only one of my coworkers to follow the laws of the road, I was also the only one who got hit by cars during the 14 months I worked there. I didn't just get hit once. 10 cars is what it took to make me quit. Most incidents were minor, but there were some broken ribs and a severe concussion in the worst cases. I went through a windshield with my face and somehow managed to get up. I had a strained relationship with my faith before that, but after the 10th incident, I figured there had to be someone looking after me. Story 50. My wife and I decided to watch a long movie in 2 sittings, pausing around the middle. I paused the movie at exactly the halfway point, down to the second. Story 51. My oldest son quit high school with 6 weeks to go, returned after a year, earned his diploma, and then attended college. He had to take an extra year due to a car accident, experienced a failed relationship, and had a daughter, for whom he eventually gained custody. It took him 7 years to complete college. Now, he has a Master of Business Administration and is a Director of Sourcing for an international chemical company. It was quite a wild ride. He advises young people that he is living proof that you can make significant mistakes and still turn your life around if you truly want to. Story 52. I ran into an old coworker at a thrift store in a different city where I now live, 7 years since we had last seen each other. She was visiting her sons who lived there. I joined them on a hike the next day, and now her eldest son and I have had the best and healthiest relationship for nearly 3 years, with marriage in our future. Story 53. Sitting in the woods alone one day, with no rain and no wind, a massive, healthy pine tree fell down a couple of 100 yards away. Story 54. My dad was a big believer in a spiritual world and believed that, under the right conditions, humans could sense what others were thinking. When I was a child, we would sit on the couch and pick random numbers from a set range, playing a game where I would guess the number he was thinking of while mentally focusing on it and repeating it silently. Smaller ranges like 1 to 10 or 1 to 20 had better odds. One day, he was thinking of a number between 1 and 1,000. I sat there silently concentrating before deciding on 637. I slowly announced the number, and my dad's face went pale. His eyes almost popped out of his head. I had guessed it correctly. My dad was a lifelong alcoholic and a pack-a-day smoker. Over the years, his addiction worsened, he made poor decisions, and ultimately our relationship suffered greatly. I have only a handful of good memories of him after I turned 12. He passed away 11 days ago, and I find myself frequently silently communicating with him as I did 30 years ago. I will never know if I truly guessed the right number or if he wanted me to believe I did. More than ever, I hope it was real and that he can hear me clearly now. Story 55. My spinal didn't work for my cesarean section. The baby's blood pressure was dipping dangerously low. They started cutting me open after I told them to save my baby, and I felt the initial cuts. I was quickly put under general anesthesia. Oh, I forgot to mention this happened twice. Story 56. I climbed my first mountain, Green Mountain, at 16 while passing through Boulder, Colorado. I got a little lost and decided to climb a second mountain, Bear Peak, to figure out how to get back. I had watched Sage Canaday on YouTube for a while and saw him climb Bear Peak the night before in my hotel. As I was regrouping on Bear Peak, Sage Canaday himself showed up. He has been my inspiration to become an ultra-marathon runner since I was 12. Story 57. Lightning came through the window above and behind the stove while I was mixing in an iron pan. I was in shock, enough to feel as if it pushed me back, similar to the strange sensation of receiving an electric shock from an actual plugged-in appliance. Story 58. I was rear-ended while stopped at a red light twice during the same 15-minute trip. The first incident left a small scratch, and the second caused enough damage that we had to tow the vehicle. I can't understand how someone accelerates and hits a stationary car, but it happened to me 2 times in a row. Story 59. I escaped childhood poverty and became a net worth millionaire, which I know isn't a lot of money these days, but it will get me through my golden years without having to downgrade my lifestyle too much. Story 60. When I was 12, a minor miracle happened. My dad owned a pet store, and we had a very expensive African gray parrot. I had the door partially open to sweep, and this precious bird flew out. My stepmom was abusive, both physically and mentally. She immediately told me that if I didn't get that bird back, I would face severe consequences. I ran down the busy street with my sister, crying and screaming for the bird. He was much faster and eventually landed on top of a tall pole. I knew I was in trouble. Suddenly, an animal control truck drove by. I had never seen one in person until that day, and I don't believe I've seen one since. The officer saw us, got out to help, and caught the bird. He happened to have a tall ladder and an even longer pole with a net. The statistical probability of that truck with those tools, randomly driving by my small town street at that exact moment, seeing us, and stopping to help was impossible to calculate. The bird was fine and I avoided serious trouble. To this day, I believe in miracles. Story 61. When I was in first grade, my babysitter and neighbor helped me enter an Etch A Sketch contest. She then passed away, and about 3 months later, I won first place for my age group, which earned me a trip to New York to see the toy fair and $500. Story 62. I fell down the stairs and grabbed the railing, twisting my arm so quickly that I pulled my radius and ulna apart. I spent 5 weeks in a cast that I had to slowly tighten until they were back in place. My orthopedic doctor said she had never seen anything like it in her 30 years of practice. Story 63. First of all, do not drink and drive, especially kids. This incident took place in the early 1990s, before cell phones were as common as they are today. For my 18th birthday, my cousin bought me a bottle of vodka and took me to a remote drinking spot on the back roads of Maine. I mixed most of the bottle with orange juice and woke up in a snowy ditch, just an inch away from a rock larger than my car. The first people to pass by were some college students who attempted to tow me out. I was so intoxicated that I attached my jumper cables to their bumper and then to my own, hoping for the best. Unfortunately, it did not work out as planned, and they left, saying they would go get a rope. The second person to arrive was an older woman who was understandably upset about my drinking and driving. She stated she would call the police before leaving. The third person to show up was my cousin, who stayed with me as a police officer arrived. The officer made excuses for my behavior, suggesting I must have hit a patch of black ice. I agreed and repeated, "I slipped on black ice." The fourth person was the tow truck driver, who demanded $90 upfront to pull my car out of the ditch, expressing frustration at being woken up at 3 o'clock in the morning. My cousin and I were both too broke to afford that amount, so the driver insisted he should be compensated for his time. The fifth person to come by was another police officer, who also believed I had slipped on a patch of black ice. Throughout the encounter, my cousin urged me to be quiet, suggesting that the officers might let me go if I did. As we argued with the tow truck driver, the college students returned with a tow rope. I was so intoxicated that I turned in the wrong direction while they dragged my car out of the ditch and onto the street. I thanked them profusely, and they went on their way. The first officer placed both hands on the windowsill of my car as I sat in the driver's seat. He looked me in the eyes and said, "Go home. Go straight home. Do not go anywhere else but to bed." I complied, leaving my cousin behind to pay the tow truck driver the $20 he had left in his pocket to settle matters. The next day, my cousin informed me that the officers had spoken with him after everyone else left. One officer was heading home from a long shift while the other was on his way to a long shift, and neither of them wanted to fill out the paperwork. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.